back to my channel. Today we're going to be talking about one of the greatest tragedies of all time. And I can't believe that I only found out about this a couple of months ago. I must have been seriously living under a rock. It wasn't until one of my friends brought this up in a conversation. Once I started to research it, I went down a rabbit hole and it seemed impossible to be able to get out of it. Between 1939 and 1990, 300,000 babies were snatched, kidnapped, and illegally trafficked from Spanish mothers. How could this possibly happen? You might be asking. To answer that question, we need to go back in time. It all started when Spain was going through its civil war in 1939. At this time, Spain was being ruled or governed by a fascist dictator, General Franco. Him and his buddy, Antonio Vallejo Nájera, had similar scientific theories to Nazi Germany, and they believed in positive eugenics. Their ideas were slightly different. It wasn't about race as such, like blue eyes, blonde hair, white skin. It had nothing to do with that really. It was to do with eliminating the red gene. You might be asking, what is the red gene? The red gene, according to them, belonged to children who grew up or were going to grow up or were born in the families of those who opposed the regime. What this means is that anybody that opposed the dictatorship had that gene. And they wanted to control the state so much that they truly believed that ripping kids apart from their families was the right thing to do. As Antonio would say, he believed that if the children stayed with their families, they would be mentally affected. So what was their approach? They started to take the children of political prisoners. Sometimes they would literally take the babies by force and then their mothers, or they would take the children that were already orphaned after they executed those political prisoners. By doing this, they believed that they would ensure the purity of the regime. They would make sure it was cleansed and that everybody would benefit. So what happened to these children after they were ripped away from their crying mothers? They were then placed in a care facility, the Franco care facilities, where these children would be brainwashed and then they would be placed in homes of those families who were loyal to the regime. As time went on, they realized that this could potentially be a very lucrative business because at the time there was a huge demand for children. There was a huge stigma around pregnancy, around families not being able to get pregnant. And going through the adoption process, the legal adoption progress, was too tedious for some people. And they didn't want their neighbors or they didn't want their family knowing that they had to adopt because it would bring shame on their families. So what happened? These people were so desperate that they were willing to pay the equivalent of 18,000 euros today for a baby, without the hassle of adopting, without having to sign any papers, and then the child could grow up thinking that these people were their parents. Going through this route, the close adoption seemed the way to go. So how did this business grow? How did they make it all work? There was a huge network, and of course, as you can imagine, the Catholic Church was involved. There were priests, Catholic doctors, nurses, nuns, a whole institution, a whole underground network, very secretive, that opposed their movement. This group was constantly on the lookout. They were looking at families of lower socioeconomic means. They were looking at single mothers. They were looking at farming families with little to no income. They were looking at anyone who was undesirable in the community. They were also on the lookout to see what families were desperate enough to pay a large sum for a child. Once they spotted a family, they had a target. Remember that at that time, midwives and matrons were mostly nuns, and they belonged to this network. So once a mother gave birth, they would take the baby and then hide the baby, and they would tell the mother that their baby had passed away. Of course, as a mother, if you're told that your baby died, you want to see your baby. You want to give it a proper burial. You want to mourn it. You still want to hold it because it's yours. Sometimes the mothers didn't even get to hold their babies. They would just take them and say, oh, your baby died. And they would just expect the mother to forget about it. And then when the mothers would cry and say, no, let me see my baby. I want to give it a proper funeral. I want to see my baby. I want to see the body. In most instances, they would say, oh, we don't want to upset you. The body's just too much for you. You don't want it. And when a mother would kick up a fuss or a family would cry and say, no, I demand to see my baby, they had a photo of an already deceased baby somewhere in a freezer, and they would come and show a fake baby photo to the mother and say, look, that's your baby. And if the mother was still persisting, I want to see my baby, you will not believe what the nuns would say. They would say, okay, you can, for a price. And remember, the people that they targeted were of low income, so they couldn't pay this ridiculous price to see their baby, right? In other occasions, what they would do is they would coerce a parent, an expecting mother. Give your baby up for adoption. It's not right for you to have the baby. Like, you don't have the means to have this child. So the best thing that you can do is just give it to us and we'll put it in a good home. And then if the mother took it back and said, like, I don't want to give my baby up for adoption, they didn't care. No, there was no take back. They would literally kidnap your child and walk away because you had already pre-agreed to it. And remember, they would actually play mind games with these mothers. Okay, so it's not like, oh yes, no. And even if you did agree to adopt your child up, you're allowed to change your mind. You're allowed to say, I don't want to give my baby up for adoption, give him back to me. It's as simple as that. But not to the nuns, not to the network. Their business was more important. So where did these babies go? After the mysterious death of the baby, or taking the baby away by force from a parent. So what happened to these babies after they were snatched, literally kidnapped from their parents, ripped apart from their families? They would then be placed in orphanages. Their records would be burnt and destroyed, so they could never be found. At the orphanages, the babies would be treated appallingly. They would be abused by the nuns, beaten, hit. Some stories actually say that if a child accidentally wet their bed overnight, the nuns would make them take off their knickers and walk around saying, I did it, by shaming them and humiliating them. But this was all okay in their minds and in their eyes, because they were actually going to place the babies with approved homes. When a family was ready to adopt this baby, or when the baby was actually going to the approved home, the nuns would dress them up super nice, line them up like cattle, and then the potential parents would come along and be like, inspect the children, their hair, their teeth, their fingers and everything, and be like, okay, I want that one. Pay the sum, take the child. If it wasn't that, sometimes they would place orders. I know it sounds crazy, but they'd be like, I want a baby with blonde hair, blue eyes. So I want the baby brunette and with dark brown eyes. Okay, yep, I've got it for you. And then ship the baby off, falsifying the documents, the birth certificates, everything to fit the new parents. These orders came about because apparently at the time, the priests or the nun or whoever this approved family approached would tell them, fake a pregnancy, pretend to be sick when you are around your neighbors, put a pillow under your garments to fake the pregnancy. By this time, we'll have the baby for you. This practice and the child trafficking continued even after Franco's death. It wasn't until 1987 that Spain passed new adoption legislation to match the countries around the world. Even now, as far as I'm aware, there has been no official apology from the government or any address to this atrocity. The statistics actually show that babies were still being kidnapped until the late 1990s. What is heartbreaking though is that even now, when people are trying to find their loved ones or trying to reconnect, it's extremely hard because the records have been destroyed or are sealed, and it is very difficult to get access to those records. Between 2011 and 2021, more than 2,000 investigations have been launched, but only a quarter of those have gone to court. And the frustrating thing is that only the recent cases are really being looked at. Unfortunately for most of these families, they won't get closure, but the Spanish mothers are fighting. In 2018, hundreds protested, wanting the government to acknowledge this tragedy, wanting them to give some retribution and help them connect with their missing children. I'm not sure how many would ever be able to get closure. I'm not sure how a country or how society could ever recover from this. These children weren't just trafficked to other regions of Spain. These children were trafficked all around the world. Only 2 people, as far as I'm aware, were kind of going to trial for this. A gynecologist and a nun. But by that time, these people were so old. But one thing is for sure. The Catholic Church needs to be held accountable for the atrocities that they've committed around the world. And with that, my lovelies, I'll leave you. I have linked a lot of resources down on the description below. Some are in Spanish and some are in English. If you're interested, go and have a read. I suggest you do so because being aware of our history is important so it is not repeated. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you guys on the next video. Bye.